For over 4 years now, we've watched Russia do something that, for most of that time, Ukraine simply couldn't answer. The tactic was fairly simple and yet devastating. A Russian Su-34 would climb to somewhere safe behind the front line, then release a fat glide bomb, a fancy term for a Soviet-era unguided bomb fitted with pop-out wings and a satellite navigation kit. The bomb would sail between 50 and 70 kilometers onto Ukrainian positions, hopefully on track toward its intended target. But while that bomber would do its work, a second Russian jet, usually a Su-35, orbited higher and farther back, watching the sky, ready to punish any Ukrainian fighter that tries to interfere. The bomber bombs the escort guards. This division of labor was helped by the fact that Russia maintained an extreme numerical advantage in terms of how many aircraft it fielded. At the start of the war, the record was 10-1 in Russia's favor. The most reliable sources suggested Russia had between 1,300 and 1,400 aircraft, while Ukraine had only 120 or so fighters at its disposal. And this has let Russia pulverize the Ukrainian side of the frontline region with thousands of guided bombs every single month. Ukraine's response to that was, for the longest time, limited to using its existing anti-air systems as well as donations from the West. In most extreme cases, it would inevitably have to send some donated aircraft like the Mirage 2000s and F-16s into the sky to destroy as many glide bombs as possible or provide at least a deterrent. But by mid-2026, Ukraine has started having more options, and one of the most ingenious ones is that they've thrown the ball back in Russia's court by doing the same thing. Ukraine has taken the very same playbook that's been used to grind it down, copied it almost move for move, and pointed it back across the line. So let's discuss how this tactic actually works, why Ukraine couldn't really use it until recently, and why it's about to become a far bigger problem for Moscow than it already is. Now let's elaborate a bit on the tactic itself, because the description we have of it comes from an unusual place. The account was published in late June 2026 and reportedly traces back to a Russian Telegram channel that goes by the name The Commander Speaks or Voivoda Broadcasts, which could have close ties to the Russian Air Force. That provenance matters because a Russian military blogger describing Ukrainian tactics has every reason to frame them in a particular way, badly. And yet what we're seeing here aligns with Western analyses and predictions, meaning that it has more hallmarks of being proven true. Here's how it works. Ukrainian warplanes go out in pairs. One jet flies low and fast toward the target, carrying a payload of precision glide bombs aiming to hit Russian forces in or near the grey zone. As it nears its release point, it pulls up sharply into a climb. The climb is due to physics since a glide bomb has no engine. The higher and faster you are when you let it go, the more kinetic energy it carries, and the farther it flies before gravity brings it down. So the bomber keeps low to stay under the radar horizon, then zooms up at the last moment to fling its bombs as far as possible. The physics behind it match what Russia has been using, at least so far. But the problem with that climb is that it exposes you. A jet hugging the terrain is hard to see and hard to shoot. The moment it rises to lob its bombs, it lights up on the Russian radar, and that's exactly when a Russian fighter on patrol might pounce. This is where the second Ukrainian jet earns its keep. The second aircraft, which is usually an F-16, sits back at a distance and higher up, holding an air-to-air missile ready. If a Russian Su-35 or Su-30 lunges toward the bomber, the escort launches. In the F-16's case, that missile is the American AIM-120 AMRAAM. Now, that AMRAAM might not actually shoot the Russian jet down. The ranges in this war are long, the Russian fighters are fast, and a missile fired this way is usually meant to force a reaction rather than to score a kill. But forcing a reaction is the entire point, and often enough. A Russian pilot who sees an AMRAAM streaking toward him has to break off, dump his intercept, and take evasive action. In those few seconds, the Ukrainian bomber has already dropped its load and is running for home. The Russian source also pivoted to Ukrainian pilots' situational awareness, noting that the moment Russian fighters launch, the Ukrainians abort and flee the battlefield. The evading Russian might get a hasty shot off with an R-37 or R-77 of his own, but by then, the Ukrainians are usually already speeding away and tracking that missile the whole time. So the escort tactic at this stage is not really about winning dogfights, but about buying the bomber a clean release and a clean exit. And to understand why Ukraine needs that shield so badly, we have to talk about the single weapon that has shaped the air war over Ukraine more than any other. That weapon is the R-37M, and it's the reason Ukrainian pilots have spent the better part of this war flying with their bellies almost scraping the treetops. The R-37M is a Russian long-range air-to-air missile carried by the MiG-31BM interceptor and increasingly by the Su-35 and Su-57. Depending on the source and the variant, its range is given as anywhere from 150 to 400 kilometers, and it flies at something like 5 to 6 times the speed of sound. Now, those headline numbers deserve a heavy dose of caution. The 300 to 400 kilometer figure assumes a high-flying launch from a MiG-31 with its powerful radar, but the missile here is fired from a Su-35 with a smaller radar, so its practical reach is considerably shorter. The export version, the RVVBD, is advertised at up to 200 kilometers and is likely more in line with what the missile actually accomplishes. But even the conservative end of that range is far longer than anything Ukraine could shoot back with for most of the war. The London-based Royal United Services Institute reported that as far back as October 2022, Russia was firing up to 6 R-37Ms a day at the Ukrainian Air Force. Ukrainian pilots have told reporters the missile rarely scores a clean kill, but that almost misses the point. Its job is not necessarily to destroy, but to deter Ukraine from deploying its own aircraft. Simply trying to mount a defense at a high altitude can be potentially fatal when facing long-range air-to-air missiles, making the simple act of climbing a potentially deadly decision. The result was that its MiG-29 and Su-27 pilots were forced down to altitudes where they could use terrain and ground clutter to hide from Russian radar and missile seekers. Down there, they were safer from the R-37M, but now vulnerable to ground fire and to the very Russian glide bombers they were trying to stop. Ukraine has already had a casualty as a result of this. In mid-May 2026, Russian aviation telegram channels claimed that a Su-35 has shot down a Ukrainian F-16 near Sumy using a long-range R-37 series missile. If this is true, it would be the first time a Ukrainian F-16 was lost in air-to-air combat rather than to ground fire or accident. That alone tells you about the potential danger of the R-37M in a place where simply being detected can get you killed. That's the threat the Escort tactic is trying to manage. Which brings us back to the missiles in Ukrainian hands, and to the arithmetic of who can hit whom from how far. The F-16 is, in mid-2026, the best Escort Ukraine has. It carries a modern radar, capable electronic warfare gear, and the AIM-120, which belongs to a family of similar yet vastly different missiles. Older variants reach out to roughly 75 kilometers, while the newest version Ukraine is reported to field, Ukraine's AIM-120C8, stretches that out toward 160. That's a serious weapon. But the Russian channel also noted that Ukraine doesn't always have an F-16 to spare, so it improvises, mixing and matching. A Soviet-era Su-27 flying top cover for a MiG-29, both leaning on the old R-27 missile, or even a Su-27 covering another Su-27. The R-27 is a much shorter range, much older weapon, which tells you how much Ukraine is making to do with what it has. And we have to go back to the statistics from the beginning of this report. Despite this tactic, Russia still has more bombers and more fighters in the sky over the grey zone, and it still drops far more bombs. There is no aerial parity here, not yet. Instead, Ukraine has finally found a way to contest airspace it previously had to completely concede. So the tactic is the workaround, and the thing that could turn the workaround into something genuinely decisive is a missile that finally outranges the problem. And it turns out that such a missile is on its way. It comes aboard the Saab JAS-39 Gripen. In late May 2026, Sweden and Ukraine announced the largest Western fighter package Ukraine has ever secured, where Sweden will donate up to 16 of its in-service Gripen C and D jets, with the first expected to arrive in early 2027. While Ukraine intends to buy up to 20 new-build Gripen E and F fighters, financed with 2.5 billion euros, or about $2.8 billion from a European Union loan, with deliveries projected from 2030. All of that sits under a letter of intent signed in October 2025, leaving the door open to a fleet of between 100 and 150 aircraft. Sweden has been explicit that the package also includes advanced air-to-air weaponry like the IRIS-T, AMRAAM, and crucially, the Meteor. The Meteor is the piece that matters most for the story we're telling. Instead of a rocket motor that burns out in seconds and leaves the missile coasting, the Meteor uses a throttleable ramjet that keeps producing thrust. That gives it a much larger no-escape zone at long range. Saab officially lists its reach as more than 100 kilometers and reports it as possible 200 kilometers. The International Institute for Strategic Studies has also referred to the Meteor as the most capable air-to-air missile currently in service on Western combat aircraft. But here's why that flips the Escort tactic. Out of the missiles available to Ukraine, only the Meteor has the effective range to genuinely threaten a Su-34 launching glide bombs from 60 to 100 kilometers behind the front line. The AMRAAMs on the F-16s and the Mika missiles on Ukraine's French Mirage 2000s simply lack that reach under real frontline conditions. In practice, if the Ukrainian Escort fires an AMRAAM, it will mostly just spook the Russian fighter into breaking off. But if you put a Meteor on a Gripen flying that same top cover role, and suddenly the Escort can reach out and actually kill the Russian bomber that's doing the glide bombing in the first place. Notably, the Meteor doesn't quite match the very longest reach of the R-37M, but it outdistances the old R-27, edges out even the newest AMRAAM, and matches the R-77. For an air force that has spent 3 years outrange, that's a profound change. And the Gripen is also particularly important for Ukraine's predicament for reasons that go beyond the missile. It was designed during the Cold War to survive precisely the kind of war Ukraine is fighting. It can disperse off its main bases and operate from stretches of ordinary highway, with a small ground crew and quick turnarounds, on the assumption that Soviet missiles would crater its airfields on day one. The aircraft also plugs straight into NATO data links and carries a more modern kind of radar and electronic warfare suite that the older donated F-16s don't. But a tactic like this one doesn't just need missiles alone. There are 3 vital parts here: missiles to guard the bombers, jets to fly, and the actual bombs to drop. And what makes summer 2026 so important is that the stars have seemed to align for all of these to start arriving simultaneously. But before we delve into these, make sure to hit the subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the military show. We post daily videos covering all the notable events in the war in Ukraine and beyond. Back to the trifecta of a successful Escort mission. We first have the bombs. For most of the war, the glide bomb advantage was entirely Russia's. By early 2025, Russia was releasing around 3,500 glide bombs a month, well over 100 a day across the front. The monthly total hit a record of more than 5,700 in January 2026, and Russia likely dropped on the order of 85,000 of these bombs in 2024 and 2025 alone, where it has also planned to manufacture 120,000 of them in 2025. The kits themselves are almost crudely cheap, somewhere around $20,000 a piece, which is exactly why Russia can afford to throw them in such numbers. Ukraine can't match that volume, given that most of its military industry is based on drones. But it no longer has to start from zero. It's been receiving American glide bombs, including extended-range JDAMs, and in May 2026, Ukraine unveiled its first domestically developed glide bomb, carrying a roughly 250-kilogram warhead into combat use through the Brave One Defense Tech Hub. More Ukrainian bombers carrying more Ukrainian bombs means more sorties that need escorting, which is precisely why the pair tactic is emerging in 2026 and not a year ago. Second, the missiles. An Escort is only as good as the weapon it carries, and Ukraine's allies are topping it up. In mid-June 2026, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius announced that Germany would hand over an undisclosed 3-digit number of air-to-air missiles from its own stockpiles, on top of fresh IRIS-T air defense systems, a $400 million contribution toward air defense ammunition for Ukraine, and another $200 million for PAC-3 Patriot interceptor missiles under NATO-backed procurement initiatives. Pistorius didn't specify which missiles, but the obvious candidates are the AIM-9 and AIM-120 that arm Ukraine's F-16s today, or the IRIS-T and Meteor rounds that will arm the Gripens tomorrow. Either way, it's the ammunition the Escort tactic literally can't function without. Delivered at the moment, Ukraine is starting to use it in earnest. Third, the jets. This is where Belgium enters the picture, and the commitment is larger than it first appears. Belgium has outlined a plan to hand its entire F-16 fleet of 53 aircraft to Ukraine by 2029, as it transitions to the F-35. The schedule included 7 jets in 2026, of which 3 would fly, and 4 would be stripped for spares, then 5 more in 2027, 14 in 2028, and 27 in 2029. That's on top of the F-16s already pledged by the Netherlands, which has committed 24, Denmark with 19, and Norway with 6. Belgium's contribution alone would make it one of the largest single donors of the entire coalition. There's just one catch here. Belgium is only sending its aircraft contingent on it receiving the newer F-35s it ordered. But those F-35s have run late, and most of the jets won't come until the end of the decade. Norway's 6 F-16s had reportedly not all reached Ukraine as of April 2026, with some still being refurbished in Belgium and others delivered in pieces. Donated fighters are often decades old and need months or years of inspection and overhaul before they can fly in combat. And Ukraine has already confirmed the loss of 3 F-16s in the war. So while Ukraine is getting a Western fighter force, it's a gradual improvement rather than an explosive procurement overnight. And while this tactic should work great for the contested grey zone, Ukraine might not need to solely remain in it for long. In June 2026, a Russian military-affiliated Telegram channel claimed that Ukraine had used a new American-supplied missile, the AMRAAM Rusty Dagger, to strike a semiconductor plant called Saborka in the Russian city of Voronezh. As with the other Russian-sourced claims, this hasn't been confirmed by Kyiv or Washington. But the weapon itself is notable. The Rusty Dagger is the product of a US Air Force program called AMRAAM, the Extended Range Attack Munition, which was launched in early 2024 with an unusually blunt primary purpose, giving Ukraine an affordable, mass-producible long-range strike weapon, and doing so faster than traditional procurement timelines would imply. The missile is a hybrid between a cruise missile and a guided bomb, sized to fit the same envelope as a standard 220-kilogram Mk-82 bomb. In principle, any aircraft that can carry that bomb can carry the missile. The big part here is the reported range, which is supposedly more than 930 kilometers when using a more modest 45-kilogram warhead. The first production batch of 840 missiles was actually slated for delivery in October 2026, with Ukraine cleared to buy up to 3,350 of them in total. So the debut in June 2026 implies that some number of missiles have already reached Ukraine and are likely being field tested on actual targets. The shape and size of the missile are also key. If it fits any JDAM-capable aircraft, a single squadron of 12 F-16s could deploy as many as 144 of these missiles in one sortie. That's the same flexible platform thinking that underpins the Escort tactic, just scaled up from the contested zone to deep inside Russia. The F-16 and the Gripen could quickly become Swiss Army aircraft, a glide bomb deployer, a missile-armed escort, and a long-range cruise missile launcher, depending on what's needed at a given time. None of this means Ukraine has won the air war just yet. Russia still has the largest air force, the biggest stockpile of bombs, and the longest-range missile on the board. The Gripens are years from arriving in numbers. But the key is that all of these parts are finally being assembled, and Ukraine already has a field manual on how to execute the tactic and has been working relentlessly to perfect it. So once all these parts arrive, it can make more headlines. Now, if you want to learn more about the Gripens and how they started flying over Ukraine, check out this video, and make sure to subscribe to the Military Show so you can stay up to date with the most recent developments.